In any of the previous, also, wars, Egypt never waited or asked for Israel's permission to open or close the Rafah crossing. You had, a war in 2014 where Egypt stood completely and publicly and sided with Israel. You will find all the regime publicists are like, they were parroting Israeli propaganda. They were calling for the defeat of Hamas. They linked Hamas to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and it's like the same fight against terror. Sisi is not a strategic thinker who can project, long-term plans. That Egypt's choices when it came to what to do in vis-a-vis foreign policy now became hostage to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or wherever the West, wants. It was unimaginable that any form of deals, agreements done regarding Palestine that would not somehow pass through Cairo.
Hossam, it's so lovely to have you here, really.
Thanks a lot. The pleasure is all mine.
Thank you for coming. So I wanted to talk to you. You've written a lot quite recently about Egypt and its fading regional role. And you actually used a really lovely turn of phrase. You said Egypt has been exposed as a declawed old lion, which I loved. I thought it was a great image. Yeah. Can you explain a bit more?
I think... for anyone who's studying Middle Eastern politics or history, and you always find this cliche, phrase, Egypt is, the mother of the world, the center of the Arab world, a pivotal state, and this and that. And some of it might be an exaggeration, but it does hold a grain of truth. Egypt has been the biggest Arab country, the most populous nation. At this point, we're roughly 110 million people, and these are huge numbers. For the Middle East. But also, Egypt is among some of the oldest states in the region, and has always had a cultural and political impact on what's going on. But what I've been arguing in some of my writings, which you are now referring to, is that it's a regional hegemon in decline. And to be more specific, yes, it's been an incremental process following Nasser's death. In case your listeners don't know, Gamal Abdel Nasser was an army officer who was among a group of nationalist officers who overthrew the British-backed king in 1952, declared the republic in 1953, and he ruled Egypt till he passed away in 1970. Nasser is regarded as one of the global south, heroes, and in so many ways, he was. He's been an anti-colonialist. He led Egypt till his death, establishing it as a pivotal state in the Arab world. Nasser branded some fiery brand of Arab nationalism, which advocated republican order, which was anti-royalist, at least till 1967. But since his death and his succession by Anwar Sadat, who is considered in the West, as a martyr for peace and an angel, but he was just an autocrat, and who actually faced a popular uprising literally in 1977 that he put down by the military. Egypt has been gradually losing its clout, but this is nothing compared to what happened after 2013. In 2013, then the Minister of Defense, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, led a military coup against Egypt's first democratically elected president, who belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood. It was a very complicated moment in Egypt's history. On the one hand, there were many people who felt bitter towards the Muslim Brotherhood rule for very legitimate, grievances. But there was also counter-revolutionary forces which saw what's been happening in Egypt over the previous 2 years as their worst nightmares. And there was some form of unholy alliance that was cemented in the run-up to the coup. And there was a discourse that was put forward by the supporters of the coup, ironically, and that links, to the topic we're discussing today, is that Morsi brought Egypt's regional clout, to the sewer. We have lost, our greatness. We have lost our regional impact. We have lost, respect of the Arab world and the world. And it's only someone like Sisi, a military man, a general, who can bring back, Egypt's glory. And I remember at the time there was all of these poorly photoshopped posters of Sisi with a lion coming, out of his ear, I think. The lion was situated. Yeah, there was there was this, rubbish online. I think it was not necessarily the work of the military intelligence, but supporters of the military coup in general. In addition to, and that's interesting, posters of Sisi with Gamal Abdel Nasser in the background.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
In direct reference that, we are back to our glory. But what happened afterwards was the complete contrary, as I've been arguing.
I wonder, you've done a really good job in your writing of kind of laying out the missteps, foreign policy missteps since Sisi came to power. I wonder if you could tell our audience a little bit about what you see as examples of how Sisi has brought Egypt into regional decline.
Sure. There are some starking, examples, but we have to understand first, why is that? Because this is not necessarily about the character itself of the president, but about the political choices and about the extent of regime legitimacy.
Or lack thereof. Right.
Right. So if you lack domestic legitimacy, if you are almost dependent fully on foreign support, then the political choices that you take at the end of the day, it's held hostage to, whoever, give you the cash. It's as simple as that. Any 5-year-old can tell you, you don't need an expert to tell you that military and political power is a reflection of economic power. If you have money, if you have a strong economy, if you have wealth, then you can afford becoming a superpower. Whether it's a superpower on the regional level or, the global scene. So in Egypt's case, in order for the military to go out of its comfort zone and to intervene in such a bloody manner, risking international sanctions, which, were put in place for some time, and international isolation, which was also the case for some time, they had to be enticed by the Gulf powers, to be more specific, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But there were also other Gulf powers like Kuwait, for example. But it was mainly the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who I consider to be the spearhead of the Arab counter-revolution. They were the ones who led, the counter-revolution against the Arab Spring. They paid the army billions of dollars. Billions. We're talking here like when Sisi rose to power and became president in 2014, Egypt's foreign debt stood at roughly $41 billion. Today, you're talking something close to $160 billion. Now, all of this money, it doesn't come as blank checks. It comes with strings attached. And this meant, going back now to your earlier question, this meant that Egypt's choices when it came to what to do in vis-a-vis foreign policy now became hostage to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or whatever the West, wants. The West and the Arab Gulf have always had, influence on Egypt, at least since Sadat's time. But it was never like we're facing today. Where can we see this? Let's take, of course, the most horrendous example, which is the war in Gaza and the Palestinian cause in general. Under Nasser, the regime raised the slogan, the liberation of Palestine. Whether, Nasser was sincere or he was working closely towards that goal or not is not, our topic to discuss today. But, this was at least the declared, slogan. Now, under Sadat, this slogan changed to, peace, and that, the October 1973 war was the end of all wars, and, it's totally different now. And under Mubarak, Egypt was reduced to solely to the role of mediator between the Arabs, including the Palestinians on the one hand, and the Israelis and the Americans on the other side. Egypt, since the signing of the peace treaty in 1979, became the second recipient of U.S. foreign aid after Israel. Now, the Americans, when they give you, this money, it's not much compared to, what the total GDP of Egypt is, but it does reflect a message, which is when Omar Suleiman, our former spy chief, used to arrive in Ramallah or arrive in Tel Aviv or arrive anywhere, I'm arriving as America's representative in the region.
Quid pro quo.
Yeah, I'm coming as the second recipient of U.S. foreign aid after Israel, so you better listen to me in that regards. Obviously, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a positive thing, on the contrary, but I'm talking here about regime and state power, and it did reflect that. It was unimaginable that any form of deals, agreements done regarding Palestine that would not somehow pass through Cairo. And Cairo would have, a bigger say in how things, are going.
Yeah.
In any of the previous, also, wars that happened, including, the one that happened under Morsi, for example, in 2012, Egypt never waited or asked for Israel's permission to open or close the Rafah crossing.
Right, I wanted to ask you about that. Right.
We never asked them, we never asked for permission of who would be allowed to leave, Gaza in order to receive medical treatment in Egypt, for example.
Wow.
This never happened.
Wow.
This never happened, before. And why is this? It's because there was regional clout. There was diplomatic power that Cairo enjoyed, at the time. Now, you contrast this with what happened after the coup in 2013. First, you had, a war in 2014 where Egypt stood completely and publicly and sided with Israel, in that regards. If you go back to the archives of the Egyptian media at the time, I'm talking here about newspapers or TV, you will find all the regime publicists are like, they were parroting Israeli propaganda, they were calling for the defeat of Hamas, they linked Hamas to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and it's like the same fight against terror. I mean, it was insane, I mean, at the time. In my view, I mean, the Egyptian regime was never really, even under Mubarak or any other regime, were like friends of Palestine. But, you know, it was never in your face like it was in 2014. Then Sisi went on this long, inhumane siege of the Strip, where no one was getting out of Gaza, you know, sometimes for even like more than a year. And then, you know, the Rafah crossing would only be open for like, you know, a couple of days, and then they close it. And it was a humanitarian disaster that Egypt was party to. Why did Egypt, and I'm not even now talking about the current genocide, but, you know, I'm just building up, you know, to what led us, you know, I mean, to today. Part of it is that Sisi owed Israel. Israel played a central role in marketing Sisi in the West. The Israeli lobby intervened more than once in order to unblock US military aid to Egypt. Israeli officials in the Western capitals were publicly, you know, I mean, courting Western officials, you know, telling them that this is the strong man that will rid the Middle East, you know, I mean, of political Islam and terrorism. So Sisi owed Israel. Sisi allowed Israel to conduct aerial strikes in Sinai.
Right.
This is a huge red line that, you know, not even in my worst nightmares under Mubarak, you know, who was always complicit with Israel, that, you know, that I would have thought that Mubarak would allow the Israeli Air Force, you know, I mean, to conduct aerial strikes in Sinai to help Egypt with its war on terror. Sisi also takes the issue of Palestine personally, because the Palestinians, and that's what every Egyptian ruler, you know, I mean, understands, have always been the biggest and the most important radicalising and politicizing factor for Egyptian youth. The current, I mean, for example, the Egyptian revolution in 2011, most of its leaders, they came from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign ranks. Most of us, you know, we were politicized through the Palestinian cause. And in so many ways, 2011 was the product of a process of anger and dissent accumulation that started with the Second Palestinian Intifada in the year 2000. So Sisi was exacting revenge against every single cause the Egyptian revolution stood for and supported, and that included Palestine. But then you fast forward to Biden's administration coming in. Sisi suddenly, and I mean, he was initially worried, you know, that he might be held accountable a little bit, you know, because Biden was making all of these statements, you know, about political prisoners, Trump's favorite dictator, and what have you. And Dania, I know this from my own sources. The moment Biden got elected, there were cheers inside Egyptian prisons among you know, many political prisoners. They were cheering, you know, I mean, this. Everyone was so desperate, and they thought that, yeah, I mean, the Americans are after their interests and what have you, but at least, you know, I mean, some of us will be coming out. And that's when you had a new war in Gaza. And Sisi suddenly exploited the opportunity to try to broker some form of mediation, you know, and to present himself as someone who can, you know, mediate. And the Egyptian general intelligence, you know, traveled back and forth, you know, like gave Hamas some concessions and what have you. And then, you know, they brokered the ceasefire. And that's when all the talk about, you know, the human rights situation in Egypt, political prisoners and what have you, you know, I mean, was over.
And yet you've written that Doha has been outshining Egypt in this role. So how did that happen, and why was the U.S. still kind of giving Sisi that slack, even though Qatar had sort of come in and played a more powerful role?
I think the role that was played by Qatar, which now became like the main negotiator, dethroning Egypt from its long established role, this became much more evident with this current war. I mean, in 2021, the war was brief. It didn't last long. And the Egyptian General Intelligence, managed to, broker a quick end to the hostilities at the time. But now with this ongoing war that started on the 7th of October 2023, it became very clear to everyone that it is actually Doha, not Cairo, where any serious deals are being conducted, where any serious negotiations could yield fruit. And it's only in like, the war didn't end, obviously, but in those brief, ceasefires that happened, or the brief recessions of operations, it was mainly Doha, not Egypt. Part of it's because Egypt's regional clout has declined massively. The other reason is that Qatar, once again, going back, if you have wealth, then you have political clout, especially if you also have ambitions in that regards. So Qatar became much more influential than Egypt in that regards. This is only when it happens to Palestine. And going back to the Rafah crossing, with the outbreak of the war, Sisi shut down the Rafah crossing and started this gaslighting, campaign where I didn't close it. It's open, but it's the Israelis on the other side who are like shutting it down. I cannot allow the aid to get in because the Israelis might bomb it. I cannot allow, the evacuated Gazans to enter Egypt except with Israel's approval, or else they'll bomb, the caravans. Well, guess what? This never happened under previous presidents. The Israelis would not have dared to do it because Cairo was a power. And even if we agree that, okay, like Egypt's clout, has declined, the Israelis are on this like killing spree has never, been seen in the last few decades. Why didn't you put your prime minister, for example, on an aid convoy to go to Gaza and see if the Israelis would have, the guts to bomb it?
But why didn't he?
Why didn't you? That was like, like how they like, why did, like imagine this, like Sisi in a caravan, like, heading to Gaza. He would have been treated like Nasser in 1956. What I mean?
This is what I want to ask. Given what you've explained about how important the Palestinian cause is to the Egyptian people, I feel like Sisi's playing with fire there at the Rafah crossing because he's balancing the Israelis with the Egyptian street.
Yeah.
What's his game here? Does he have a strategy, or is it just like a day-by-day kind of situation?
I think it's a day-by-day situation. Sisi is not a strategic thinker who can like project long-term plans, and with the very volatile situation of the economy, I think he's just like getting by week by week. In general, he could have played so many cards since the start of this war that would actually help the Palestinians.
Like what?
Like again, sending in caravans to help the Palestinians inside, headed by either himself or senior officials from his cabinet, for example. He could have threatened, to annul the peace treaty, for example, with Israel, since Israel violated it more than once. But he is extremely weak. Not just, as a president, but as a state, as a regime. It lacks domestic legitimacy. There was a point, Dania, just after the military coup, where, it was a fascist moment in Egypt's history, where there was moral panic and fear of instability. So Sisi had so much clout in the beginning that he started to lose gradually over the years. At this point, his only constituency are the senior brass. That's it. Outside the senior brass, I can assure you that Sisi enjoys zero popularity at this point. You can even see it on social media where, like, big supporters of the coup back in 2013, now, they say that we were wrong, we shouldn't have done that. Everything that, we hoped for has been dashed. And it's mainly his mismanagement of the economy and the high levels of repression that made him, lose clout. If it's one thing to be an autocrat, but someone who's successful economically. So sections of society can make this Faustian bargain of, okay, well, maybe he's a dictator, but, at least we're living well, at least, like, I'm getting good education.
Singapore, UAE, yeah.
This kind of arrangement.
Yeah.
But this is one thing. And another thing is to be an autocrat and you also suck, economically. So, what's the point?
Right.
Like, I've got nothing really, neither political freedom nor...
Yeah, honestly, I'd be curious to know, like, where this goes for you in 5 years, because as I see it, like, I just feel when I read your work and I think about what Sisi's facing and the crazy balancing act he's in and the debt that Egypt's facing and all of this, I just feel like anxious. Where does this go in 5 years? I don't see how it can continue like this.
It's not a sustainable situation. And at this point, the regime's survival is only a function of continuous bailouts by the Gulf and by the Western powers. This is not a sustainable situation. Anyway, these bailouts, they also come with a price.
I wondered if you could break down the bailouts, because I know you've said Egypt is too big to fail. Why do these powers, why does the IMF, the EU, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, why are they pumping money and what are they getting out of it? And
there was a point by the end of 2022, I think, where you could feel that some of Sisi's sponsors are saying the same things that you're saying now, like, we can't keep on doing this forever. And I think Sisi had some statement in a public event, which was actually taken out, from the local media right away. In case your listeners don't know, 99% of our Egyptian local media is literally owned by one company that is officially owned by the General Intelligence Service, by the Mukhabarat. It's called Shirka al-Muttahida, the United Media Service. And Egyptian media is literally run through a WhatsApp group run by intelligence officers and who wake up in the morning and they go on this WhatsApp group that has all of Egypt's editors and tell them, today you were talking about this. Today you were talking about that. We will ignore this. That's the discourse we're using for that. This, that, blah, blah, blah.
Hossam, can you get us on that WhatsApp group? Just to see what what a WhatsApp group to watch, right?
It's Orwellian.
That's nuts.
And this has been, exposed by investigative reporting, by Reuters and by others, but, I'm a journalist. I know through my contacts that this is how it's been run over these past few years. So this statement was taken out of the local media where Sisi went and he was like, some of our Arab brothers, they think that Egypt is incapable and is not strong enough. And and he was this kind of sad, kind of lamenting, the situation. But this was a reflection of what, the regional mood was like. We can't keep on giving you money. But why around that time? Not only because there was, a global economic crisis, with COVID and then, the war in Ukraine. But Sisi, in the eyes of the UAE and Saudi Arabia and his international backers, he has done his job. like, why did we support you in the first place? It was to finish off the Muslim Brotherhood, which, he did in a horrific, kind of way, where not only did he imprison and kill their leaders, their organizational cadres, the middle-ranking cadres, their bases, and even the periphery around their bases. The Muslim Brotherhood, is or was, the biggest political organization in Egypt. You had millions of people, around them, and the population of detainees and political prisoners is horrific. New prisons were built where, fluorescent lights are on 24/7. Many of the Muslim Brotherhood leaders and suspects have been banned visits and are kept in solitary confinement since 2013. Since 2013, imagine. We're talking here about like 12 years. Reports are coming out, of horrific, of course, torture that's happening inside, whether it's in the interrogation facilities by our Homeland Security, our secret police, or, in prisons. So he finished off the Muslim Brotherhood. He finished off the Egyptian revolution that the Gulf was so afraid about its domino effects. And he finished off, the terrorism in Sinai, and finished off, this counterinsurgency war, which took the Egyptian military an entire decade to finish off an organization of roughly 1,300 fighters only, fighting in an open terrain without really much hideouts, which also tells you a lot about the level of professionalism of our military. So why do we keep on giving him money?
So why do they?
The Gaza war happened. Just before the Gaza war, there was all of these agreements where the state, Sisi agreed to, instead of just taking the cash, that he will give back, to the Gulf, he will sell the assets of Egyptian state, meaning like historical precious hotels and palaces, giving them like large chunks of land, here and there, for them to develop into real estate luxurious, projects.
The North Coast.
And the North Coast and elsewhere.
The islands
and elsewhere in Sinai and other parts of Egypt. He will give them like, huge public sector, companies, for them to buy with like very, very low prices. And ports. Part of the UAE's foreign policy, which reminds me of the British, East India Company, is going into, countries in the global south, and actually the global north, not only the global south, and buying off, ports.
Even here in this country.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So he was in the midst of these agreements, which, it did go through. He gave them tons of stuff. But then the Gaza war happened. And that's when the West and the Gulf once again reverted to the old formula of, we cannot afford more instability in the region. Egypt is too big to fail, and if Egypt fails, then and now you have Gaza, on fire, and the whole region is like, looking at what's happening. Jordan, there are like daily mass protests that might, topple, the state. We don't know what's happening, So they all rushed in. During the first 3 months of 2024, the level of international bailouts from the Gulf and from the West and the IMF and the World Bank was over $57 billion. $57 billion in only 3 months. Now, in exchange, when these things, happen, it's not for free. And it's not just about, getting a subservient, foreign policy from Egypt, but it also comes with a price that the Egyptian people pay. I mean here, removing subsidies from basic commodities, the rise in the prices of electricity, the rise in the prices of gas, the rise in prices of fuel, of water. They've just now passed a law in the parliament, which is a rubber stamp parliament, to privatize our water services. Inflation is like soaring at this point. In the new budget, in the new draft budget submitted by the government for the financial year 2025-2026, 62% of the government expenditure will go to the debt service.
Right.
Only the debt service. 62% of the government expenditure,
right,
was just to pay for the interest and the debt service. So where is education? Where is culture? Where is medical services? Where is anything? Where is infrastructure? But all what Sisi obsessed with is his new administrative capital, this white elephant project that he's building in the desert. And the bailouts just continue. For how long? I honestly don't see this happening for too long.
Well, and you bring me to something that I want to ask about, because clearly the war has been a bit of a boon for Sisi in a way. So I'm curious about this Egyptian-led peace initiative or plan that they put together in March at the summit. What do you think is does that plan have viability? Is it dead in the water? Why are the Egyptians...
It was born dead from the start.
Okay.
I mean, the Egyptians, had to submit some counter proposal, because the only thing on the table at the time was, the displacement, plan. And then, which Trump took to a new extreme, with his Riviera and, and what have you. But, this plan, which, in theory was agreed upon by the Arab League, the devil is always in the details. This plan basically, if it had happened, it would have restructured, Gaza into a very easy kind of controllable situation for any counterinsurgency, to happen. Blocks with wide roads that tanks, can stroll through. And it was just, it's nice in theory. But for example, a country that like the UAE said, we're not putting a dime as long as Hamas still exists, in Gaza, for example. The Saudis were like, okay, we're for the plan, but then, they left back to Riyadh, they didn't leave any money, everyone is paying a lip service, to it, but it obviously it didn't happen.
Right.
Up till now.
So yet another Egyptian regional fail.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you also about Egypt and Ethiopia, because that also seems really troubling and potentially heading towards a situation. For example, if Ethiopia might turn off the water at the Renaissance Dam at this point, what would Egypt do?
The conflict with Ethiopia, is another very explicit example for how Egypt lost its regional and continental, clout. There was a time under Nasser where Egypt enjoyed immense popularity in the continent, where the Egyptian intelligence was known to be present in almost every, African city, where Africans themselves were more than happy, to help, Egypt, because Egypt was spearheading the fight for decolonizing the continent. Now, I might have, reservations about, such positive portrayal of the Egyptian role, but, in general, it was part of a trend in the global south of, let's, kick out the colonizers, more or less, which is something that, I would definitely support. Under Sadat became a pawn, or a proxy for the U.S. in fighting, anti-communist insurgencies in the continent. So Egyptian troops were involved together with the Americans, with the Israelis, with others, into containing, communism in the Horn of Africa, in confronting, the radical regimes, that were anti-US and what have you. Under Mubarak, it's always said that Egypt neglected Africa under Mubarak. Mubarak always, looked, north, didn't look, south. And the problem with Ethiopia had started, under Mubarak. This is before 2011. Because Sisi also, in order to justify his failures, always tries to blame 2011. He blames 2011 for everything in Egypt, and that would include, the crisis with the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Now, just in case your listeners don't know, Ethiopia, that's, where among the sources of the Nile water that Egypt depends on. There is previous historical agreements that were struck at the time of the Brits in order to control the quotas of the water, which country from the Nile Basin countries, receives how much water. Some African countries have always had issues with Egypt in that regard because they think that Egypt is taking a bigger share, and that these agreements need to be re-looked into once again. And in the case of Egypt says, there is no way, that's a red line. Actually, our population is also, massively increasing, so we actually might need, more water. Now, the Ethiopians, they went ahead with, building this great Renaissance, dam. And, they said, we have legitimate grievances. We need, to produce electricity. We need also, for the development, of our nation and what have you. Definitely, part of their grievances is legitimate, but the other part also has to do with the nationalist patriotic, sentiments that Abiy Ahmed, is trying to, whip up like any other, global South dictator. But to discuss the angle that we're discussing, today, which is Egypt's clout, the Ethiopians would not have managed or dared even, to do this under Nasser. There is no way, that they could have pulled this together under Nasser. Even Mubarak, whose regional clout was already, on the decline, they didn't do this. But it's only under the current regime, which has become extremely weak, which has become totally embroiled in, trying to consolidate its own powers domestically. That's not projecting any regional power. That the Ethiopians managed to pull together this Renaissance Dam, and actually it's now operational. As we're talking. Now, Egypt, at some point, or actually on different occasions, they did threaten, that we might use, military force and what have you. But, at the end of the day, neither military nor diplomatic force could sway the Ethiopians away. And what's also more, striking is that if you look at the investments around this whole project, of the dam, you will find that some of Egypt's sponsors, including the UAE, are part of it. In the same way that you will find the UAE is enjoying good diplomatic and military relations with Somaliland,
Right.
which Egypt is, against, and it's
So they're playing both sides.
for the Somali. They are playing both sides, but in the words of one of the Emirati researchers whom I interviewed at some point, she told me, Mira al-Hassan, that the UAE doesn't even see Egypt. So it's not like, they are sitting, let's play them off. No, when the Emirati decision maker is like, sitting to weigh in their options, they don't care about Egypt. It's not there. It's not a number in the formula,
Right.
That they should contend with. You can also see this in Sudan, for example. In Sudan, well, first, Egypt could not support Omar al-Bashir, who was their ally. When Omar al-Bashir fell, Sudan for Egypt was like Central America to the US, meaning it was our backyard. You always had like intelligence operations happening there, whether it's to support military coups, instigate military coups, or to support, one political faction of the other. Egypt had proxies. This was like the Egyptian regime's backyard. I'm not saying this, it's necessarily a positive thing,
Right.
but, I'm just stating, a
Intrigue.
fact.
Yeah, yeah.
But Egypt could not influence the political outcome after Omar al-Bashir's fall. It was actually Ethiopia that brokered, like this agreement between the opposition and the military at the time, which didn't hold, for more than 2 years. And then the coup, happened. It is said, and it's probably, true, that, there were some Egyptian fingerprints, involved in that coup, which actually did not really succeed. It plunged the country into, this current ongoing war. And on the one hand, Egypt is supporting the Sudanese armed forces, the Sudanese army. But the Emiratis are supporting the Janjaweed, or the Rapid Support Forces. Saudi Arabia also is supporting the Sudanese military. And both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are sponsors of the Sisi regime. So that's why Egypt's foreign policy is like an error 404, kind of like, mood. They are for the Sudanese military, but they are not really for it, They are against, the Rapid Support Forces, but they can't really go all the way, against it.
Yeah.
They're kind of like paralyzed because they have two sponsors who are at odds in that regards. So you will find this, in every step of the way. Now you ask me, what happens if Ethiopia decides, to basically cut down, the water supply. Egypt, number one, will not be able to bomb the dam, because if it bombs the dam, this means it will flood 2 or 3 countries on the way, to Egypt. This number one. So, khalas, military option is bye-bye. It's out of, it's off the table. Number 2 is to instigate, through an intelligence operation, some coup in Ethiopia.
Okay.
Well, that's not really on the table. Give me one sign that Egypt, has such regional clout, to do. Number 3, you would have expected that Egypt, would maybe restructure, its own water resources, its own water, how it uses, its own water share, comes up, with a much more efficient irrigation systems and what have you. But no, what's happening is that they are diverting the Nile into a new branch to build a luxurious new compound called Jairan. And the ones who are overseeing this project is the Air Force, who are now in control of our agricultural sector in Egypt.
And meanwhile,
Yeah.
all the planes keep crashing.
Exactly.
Right. Right.
We had at least 18 incidents since 2013.
Right.
So they are they are still, building those golf courses. They are cutting down, trees and culling off, all of the green areas, in the cities. But at the same time, in this new administrative capital, they are like building all of these luxurious palaces, for Sisi and his cabinet, with golf courses and, the greenery and what have you. So how can anyone take Egypt's grievances seriously?
Well, and Hossam, I can't help but feel, and I'm sorry if this is a really stupid question, but Sisi appears to be so weak, given what you're saying, and it seems like everyone kind of knows it. Why hasn't there been another uprising?
The level of repression in Egypt has been horrific since the coup. In order for an uprising, to happen, yes, you can get spontaneous outbursts here and there. But in order for these outbursts to develop into an uprising, you have to have organizations. By organizations here, I mean a wide variety of entities like NGOs, political parties, trade unions, unofficial youth groups, student unions, and what have you. And that's what Egypt had before 2011. But a counter-revolution does not restore the old order, because the old order has failed. And by failure here, I don't mean the things that you and I would agree upon, that, there wasn't enough respect for human rights, there wasn't good distribution of wealth, blah, blah, blah. No. In the eyes of the counter-revolutionaries, the old regime has failed because it failed to suppress the revolution. So Mubarak was too lenient. He was too weak. He allowed the circus called NGOs, human rights, and what have you, to operate. Mubarak allowed the media to criticize him. So in the eyes of Sisi and the generals who led the 2013 military coup, these guys, most of them belonged to class 69 that graduated from the military college in 1977. So they started their military career in an era where there were no wars, where the military became a bloated bureaucratic organization geared towards domestic policing and economic profiteering. They didn't see the blunders of military rule under Nasser, for example. So these guys were very confident and very arrogant. And by the way, Sisi and the other generals of his age, during the 18 days, and this is something that you can know now from American writers like former diplomats and former ambassadors who actually had some, inner kind of knowledge and look into what's happening. They were the hawks. It's not true, because Sisi has been spinning off this tale that, he expected the revolution, so, he's the one who told the SCAF to side with the Met. And it's not true. Sisi was among the hawks who were for cracking down on the protests during the 18 days. So these guys, what they did after 2013 is that they dismantled the entire political scene in Egypt. I call it the desertification of Egypt's political scene. So they went after the Islamists initially, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis. Then they went after the left and the liberals. Then they went after everyone, including apolitical charities, even any form of entity that's independent from the state got completely dismantled, smashed. And what you have now, Dania, is the state ruling over society without any buffers. Like under Mubarak was an autocrat. I mean, I was tortured under Hosni Mubarak. I have no love for him, I mean, at any point or at any level. But Mubarak used to outsource policing to a variety of civil society institutions before he had to send in the troops. So let's say, like, you had a war in Gaza where Mubarak knew that this will instigate riots or protests or there is public anger. There was the Muslim Brotherhood that Mubarak absolutely hated them, but he was more than happy to allow them to protest. Protests that will never leave the university campus.
Right. Let the steam off somewhere.
That will never take to the streets. That will never chant against Mubarak. That will never clash with the police.
Yeah. And now you don't have any of that.
You don't.
Yeah.
If that's before he had to send in the police. So, he had so many mechanisms, not just the Brotherhood. I mean, this is the most important, actually, example, The Brotherhood were there for you to negotiate with in Tahrir during the 18 days. Now you don't. You don't have anyone.
Right.
So when you say, why isn't there, a new uprising? We've seen in September 2019 and September 2020, few outbursts here and there. Now, I'm someone who belonged to the Egyptian left. I'm a member of the Egyptian Revolutionary Socialists. And so we have our sources in the labor movement. We're involved. And from our involvement, we can see that there is some incremental rise in industrial actions. For example, last January only, during the month of January, you had from 20 to 30,000 Egyptian workers taking part in industrial actions just in 1 month. This is not getting enough coverage by the media because also it's not taking a very generalized form like it was in 2006 when we had our winter of labor discontent at the time. But you can see that it's incrementally rising here and there. This also comes with its own problems. Once again, organizations, they have been dismantled. The generation that led the winter of labor discontent from 2006 till 2014, that's when the strike wave ended, basically. These guys are either retired or died or got victimized, and some of them were co-opted by the regime. Last year, for the first time since 2014, Ghazl al-Mahalla went on strike. Mahalla is the largest textile mill in Egypt and has so much political weight. The government arrested around 200 workers, but then released them right away, except for 2, Wael Abu Zuwaid and Muhammad Tolba. These were kept in prison, I think, for 2 or 3 months, for some time. These were the only 2 who were left from the old generation.
Oh.
So they are the 2 who knew how to draft a statement.
Well,
who knew how to distribute a statement.
Right.
Who knew how to barricade the factory. Who knew how to negotiate. So it's this kind of layer of organizers that we are missing, today in Egypt. Will there be an uprising? Yes, there will be an uprising. And this is not a naive kind of optimism. The Arab Spring, just to refresh our memories, happened essentially because of 2 reasons. One is the political repression and police brutality. The other is the unequal distribution of wealth. These were the main 2 structural problems that led to the 2011 revolution. Did the counter-revolution provide answers to these problems? No. It's become even worse, today. To the extent that some people are nostalgic, to Hosni Mubarak's days. And I don't blame them. Hosni Mubarak is like a human rights activist compared to, the guy that we have today. So the objective conditions for another revolt are there, but the subjective conditions, meaning the groups, the organizers, the networks to sustain this, the networks that can build on this to provide an alternative. It's this that we're lacking today in Egypt, but this cannot last forever. We can already start seeing signs that, political groups are like regrouping once again. Students who took part in the October 2023 protests, are now interested in politics and getting politicized, looking, for venues where they can express their views. Since the campuses got pacified in 2015, you had 3 or 4 generations of Egyptian youth who have graduated from the campuses, and they never took part in a protest. They never took part in a student union election, never went knocking doors in an electoral campaign, never stood, on a stool, to discuss politics. Again, the campuses were desertified. So this is the situation in Egypt. I mean, some people do not grasp the level of repression that the country has been going through since the coup. So they are wondering, where are the Egyptians? What's happening? Right. But, when the German Revolution got defeated, you didn't get the Kaiser, you got Hitler. When the Italian Revolution got defeated, you didn't get the king, you got Mussolini. When the Egyptian Revolution got defeated, we didn't get Mubarak. We got Sisi. And the level of repression has been a central factor in pacifying the situation, but it cannot last for long. Now, when people, ask that question, if you want to help, the Egyptian opposition or to help the Egyptian dissidents, is to lobby your own governments into severing ties and into stopping the aid to the Egyptian regime. This regime could not have survived these past, decade or these past 10 years without the continuous bailouts, without, the arms sales, to it, without the diplomatic support. You normalized Sisi, in the same way that, some were trying to normalize Hitler at the time. This state should be treated as a pariah, it should be boycotted. Any Egyptian official, anywhere, should be protested, against. In any press conferences, in the same way that, some now go through pictures of British politicians who supported apartheid in the 70s and, they are like exposing them, today. You have to make the same with Egypt. It has to be a very costly a decision for any Western politician to show up with Sisi. Like, they have to justify themselves. Why are they standing with this murderer at this point? So if the arms sales stop, if there is like political pressure to release the political prisoners in Egypt, this at least would be the first step towards seeing the revival of dissent in Egypt, which is already happening, but we need more help. This is the kind of solidarity that we want from people like you. I'm not putting any hopes on those in the White House or in 10 Downing Street. These are ruthless statesmen who they can talk about values, they can talk about freedom and liberty, the whole day, but at the end of the day, they don't care. They have some strategic interests that they would follow. But I am counting on journalists. I'm counting on human rights activists. I'm counting on trade unionists. I'm counting on student activists, on campaigners, labor organizers. These are our guys. These are our people. These are my brothers and sisters. And I want them to put pressure on their elected officials in order to stop aiding Abdel Fattah Sisi.
Yeah, I guess the question is, obviously we've talked about how Sisi has treated Rafah differently than previous leaders in Egypt and how that's sort of changed over time. Is that a reflection of his regional decline and loss of power, or is that something different here?
I think it's It's related to a couple of things. I mean, on the one hand, it's a decline in regional power for sure. Never in our history did Cairo ask for Tel Aviv's permission in order to let in aid or to let in anyone in and out of an Egyptian Palestinian, crossing at the end of the day. But under Sisi, who is extremely weak and has to consider so much when it comes to his foreign patrons, part of why he shut down, the crossing was that. The other reason is that he hates the Palestinians. Sisi hates the Palestinians. I mean, our ruling elites, they regard the Palestinians as an enemy. Every single twist and turn in the history of dissent in Egypt has been either directly or indirectly linked to the Palestinian cause. I've just given the example of 2011. It's essentially the central organizers in Tahrir and elsewhere were people like us who came from the ranks of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. What started to break down Hosni Mubarak's political order in Egypt was the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Intifada in 2000. This triggered a chain reaction that led to the 2011 uprising. During the first Intifada, for example, from 1987 to 1990, 1991, we didn't have independent TV stations at the time or satellite TVs, so we were only left with state-run television. At the time, the information minister, Safwat Sharif, who was Mubarak's henchman, he issued direct orders to the state TV to tune down news about the Intifada. Because guess what? I mean, Egyptians were learning about Palestine. They were imitating them in the streets at the time. The Egyptian ruling elites, they hate the Palestinians. They regard them as a source of trouble, as a source of instability. And Sisi, I think, like in his wildest dreams, would dream of like Israel, just like, wiping off Hamas, and if not wiping off, the Strip. So his decision to shut down the crossing, partially because he's weak, partially because he hates the Palestinians, and partially because he's a coward. He could have put himself, in one of the trucks, and go and lead, like, a convoy, into Gaza with the aid. And he would have been treated like, Saladin, or like, Nasser in 1956. He would have, been a regional hero, but that's not him. He's a coward. He's only brave when it comes to slaughtering his own people in public squares, when it comes to locking up and kidnapping dissidents. That's the only thing, he's brave at, but not confronting Israel.
The last question I wanted to ask you was about Alaa Abdel Fattah. The way you described previously the complete desertification of civil society, it brought me back to a conversation I had last week with Leila Swaif. We were talking about why is it that the Egyptian government cannot just release Alaa? Why are they holding him? And at this point, Leila Swaif is in hospital. She's in critical condition. I mean, she may die. What do you think is going through the minds in Egypt? It seems to me, I bring this back to what you said about desertification, because he's so important, I would think. He's one of these people who was part of the group in 2011, and somebody that would be very capable. And I wonder what you think is going through the minds of...
Partially, it's because, Alaa was involved in the revolution. But when you think about it, Alaa was never a member of any political party. Alaa did not have an organization. Alaa had his account on Twitter. So let's not exaggerate this thing that, they're really afraid that, if they release him, he will just get the masses on the streets. Like even at the height of the revolution, Ala did not have a mobilizational power. But why they hate Ala so much is because Ala became a symbol for the revolution. And Sisi, his raison d'etre, if I can call it that way, in addition to his, regime's raison d'etre, is squashing 2011, trashing anything that's close to it, near or far. Ala was one of the heroes of the revolution, and he played a role in inspiring many young activists, especially, the young, into, taking part. So Sisi's knee-jerk reaction when it comes to Ala and his family, it's that for him and for the supporters of the counter-revolution, it's the likes of Ala and his family who are to blame for, this very horrifying moment in the history of Egypt for them, where they were about to lose their privileges, were about to lose, the system that put them on top of the pyramid of power in Egypt. So Sisi has been exacting revenge on every single cause adopted by the Egyptian revolution and by those that he see as the instigators of that revolt. And this is why he's persecuting Ala and his family. It's not just Ala who's been suffering, and it's not just, Layla Swaif who's now on hunger strike. I mean, Ala's sister, Sana, was also in prison before. The British government could have secured the release, but they are cowards and they are hypocrites. And all what they care about at the end of the day is the same playbook of regional stability, getting a reliable global south dictators, that they can do business with. And they are not going to jeopardize any ties, over one of their citizens. So they only waive the human rights and democracy and freedom, card when it comes to their own enemies that they want to discipline, like Iraq, North Korea, and what have you. But when it comes to their own henchmen, they don't care.
I worry about Layla Swaif in that case.
I do worry about her, but one thing that really touched me, when I was speaking with her, I mean, so many things, to be honest, she's such a source of inspiration and she's very resilient. And despite her conditions, her mind was still sharp, She told me that the labor union in the hospital she was staying at, that they were gonna issue a solidarity statement with her. And this is the kind of allies that we actually need. I'm not putting enough, I'm not putting any hope, with 10 Downing Street. But these kind of pressures from below, that I think that these are our real allies.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful speaking with you.
Thanks a lot, Dania. The pleasure was all mine.